So good morning. Today is Tu B'Shvat, the 15th day of Shvat, and it's February 6th. And we're going to start learning from the daily portion of the Torah reading. And we're in Parashat Yitro. And Yitro was Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law. And there is some difference of opinion when he came. Did he come before the giving of the Torah or after the giving of the Torah? From the simple reading of the verses, let's read them a little bit. וישמע יתרו כהן מדיין חותן משה את כל אשר עשה אלוקים למשה ולישראל עמו כי יוציא השם את ישראל ממצרים. So Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard about all that God had done in Moses' merit, in his people Israel's merit, all that God had brought, and that God had brought them out of Egypt. So it sounds like here, since he doesn't mention that the Torah was already given, that Jethro came before the Torah was given. And this is a theme that will develop throughout the next few days. But there's this simple idea that the Torah cannot be given without a righteous convert. Meaning in this case, without Jethro, who was considered to be not just the priest of Midian, he was considered to be the master of all the forms of what today we would call idolatry, or what maybe in previous generations would be called something like animism, meaning that you feel that the world is full of spirits and forces, and you worship those. So that was the early form of human attempt to connect with something that is beyond what we see and what we experience. It's called animism. Or in general, the Torah calls it idolatry, false forms of worship, which basically means that they disconnected the forces that we see in nature from God. And they said, it's not that they didn't recognize that there was a God above everything, but they didn't worship Him. Instead, they worshiped the forces that were separate. So he was the most knowledgeable person, so it says, in the world at that time, in all these forms of idolatry. And he came, according to the literal, simple, plain meaning of the text, he came before the Torah was given to convert. And when he converted, something incredible happened. He converted, and then we read that in today's Torah reading, it starts, and it says, Vayhi mimochorat. It was after the day that he came to Moses and to the Israelites in the wilderness. Vayeshem Moshe lishpot et ha'am ve'yamod ha'am al Moshe min haboker ad ha'erev. So Jethro, it was on the following day that Moses sat to judge the people, and all the people stood respectfully around Moses from morning to evening. And Jethro sees this, and he says, this is not the right thing to do. Why is this not the right thing to do? He says to Moses, what is this thing that you're doing to the people? Why is it that you sit alone to judge them, and they're all waiting to hear what you have to say from morning to night? So Moses says to him, the people came to ask me for the right judgment about the disputes that they had, the quarrels that they had, and also about how to keep the laws that they already received. Remember, this is before the giving of the Torah, but they already knew some of the laws which they had received already in a place called Marah, which we read about in last week's Parsha on Shabbat. And there they received Shabbat, and they received the commandment to honor their parents, and a few laws between individuals. So they all came to seek the word of God. So what can I do? I have to answer them. So Jethro says to his son-in-law, this is not good what you're doing. This is too difficult for one person to take upon himself. You have to appoint a judicial system. That's what it sounds like. And then he gives them advice about what this judicial system should be like. And he tells him, you need to appoint what he calls sarim, or like appointed officials. Appointed officials, in his case, they're like a hierarchy, they're like a pyramid. but they're very interesting. They're not the way that we would think they are. He says you should have ministers of 1,000, meaning an appointed official who is responsible for 1,000 people. Sarei me'ot, those that are responsible for 100 people, for 50 people, and for 10 people. What does this mean? It means that they split up the nation in such a way that there was an official who was responsible for every group of 10 individuals. There's a question whether he's part of the 10 or not part of the 10. We're not going to get into that. And then there's a minister who's responsible for 50, meaning for 5 ministers of 10. Above that, there were ministers who were responsible for 100, meaning for 2 groups of 50. And then above those, ministers of 1,000 who were responsible for 10 groups of 100. Now you can tell that this is a pyramid, but it's not a regular pyramid. If it would have been regular, it would have gone from 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000, but that's not how we built it. So to understand the inner logic, we're not going to get into it today. Maybe on Wednesday or Thursday when we have more time. There's a very interesting observation here. I'll only tell you because I can't wait to tell you that there was a student of Rav Ginsburg. His name was Aryeh Nachaisi. He was an Iraqi Jew, a very simple man, a businessman, and he had factories. He had factories in the Dominican Republic. And he was very connected to Rav Ginsburg. He helped him in all kinds of things. And he was flying with him one day from Israel to New York. And on the way, he was sitting next to the Rav, and he had this tremendous insight into what Jethro just said. And he told the Rav his insight. First of all, he worked it out himself to see if it works. And he told the Rav this insight. And the Rav was astounded by it, because it was a beautiful observation, mathematically, what's going on here. And together they developed a whole system of management. How to manage in a factory, how to manage when you have thousands of workers. How do you make sure that everybody knows exactly what they're supposed to do? And how do you do quality control in such a way that you have complete knowledge of everything that's happening at every level? So they developed this into a whole management system, which unfortunately has never been shared with the world. But Aryeh, who had his factories in the Dominican Republic with thousands of workers, immediately put it into place there. Later he developed, back then there were no cell phones yet or smartphones, but there were handheld devices, and he developed it into something that was on one of those handheld devices, I don't know which kind, and the productivity went up by thousands of %. Something that simply cannot be underestimated, like how powerful this was. We'll get to that hopefully on maybe on Wednesday or Thursday. In the meantime, what we want to focus on is that not only was Jethro accepted, because he could have also not been accepted. Who was Jethro? Yitro was the advisor of Pharaoh, of Paro, when the Paro who started the very difficult phase of the enslavement in Egypt. He was his advisor. So he probably wasn't there at the very beginning, but he was there over time. And seeing that he had no influence, he fled Egypt. He ran away. There's a very strong, powerful reason why we know that from the Torah, that he was there, but the Medrash tells us that. And now he comes, and he also was the priest of all the forms of idolatry. It was not so simple that this individual would be accepted, even though he was Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law. He was a very controversial figure. And yet, the Medrash says that God said to Moses, he comes for the right reasons, you need to accept him. And he converted him, but not only did he convert him, he took his wisdom. And the wisdom became part of the Torah, and it becomes part of the introduction to the giving of the Torah. Now I want to read to you from the Rabbeinu Bechayei. Rabbeinu Bechayei is one of the early medieval commentaries on the Torah, and he learns from this something amazing, which is connected to another thing that Rav Ginsburg has been working on for the last 8-10 years, which is called the fourth revolution in Torah teaching, which is that we now have to encourage non-Jews to learn Torah. And listen to what the Rabbeinu Bechayei says. It is possible to explain the proximity of these two paragraphs. Which paragraphs? At the end of Beshalach, we saw the fight against Amalek, and now in our parsha this week, Parashat Yitro, the arrival of Yitro, Jethro, followed by the paragraph of the revelation, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, in the following way. How do we explain? Why was there Amalek, then Jethro arrived, then the giving of the Torah? Why this order? He says like this: it is a fact of life that the descendants of Esau, are a painful thorn for the Jewish people throughout our history. No less so during the first hostile encounter reported at the end of Parashat Beshalach, when Amalek attacked it. Amalek is the grandson of Esau. Then at the end of our exile, the same thing will happen now at the end of this exile, when God will bring the final redemption. We have a hint here that just as Israel was successful in its first encounter with Amalek with the help of Moses and Joshua, so it will be during the final encounter in the future. So he says, first of all, you should know that we'll be able to win the battle against whatever we need to win now in this final exile, as we were able to then at the end of that exile before the giving of the Torah in our fight with Amalek. During the exile in which we find ourselves nowadays, we will be helped by the prophet Elijah. That everybody knows, that before the redemption, the prophet Elijah comes. What does that mean, that the prophet Elijah comes? The usual meaning is that there's a new way of understanding things that helps us bring the redemption in. One of the examples of this by a very big tzaddik in Yerushalayim is that he claimed that Elijah in our generation means understanding lowliness, being able to understand this concept of shiflut. That this concept of shiflut, and we're not going to talk about now, but which we talked about when I was there in California a lot, and now we're doing in our classes on the nefesh.org, he says this is the prophet Elijah. This is what it means, that there's an understanding, a revelation of new information that comes to people that helps us get through these final stages. In any case, now he says something. Now listen to what the Bechayei says. Just as the first redemption resulted in Yitro, Jethro, converting to Judaism and returning to the fold, because his ancestor was Avraham, he came from a Semitic family, so as a result of the final redemption, all the surviving Gentile nations will convert and join Judaism. An incredible thing that he says almost 1,000 years ago. He says, what does this come to teach us? That know that before the redemption, the end of the redemption from Egypt was the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Before that happens, the nations of the world will come to seek us and will ask to be converted. He says the ones that are righteous, like Yitro, need to be accepted right away. And not only do they need to be accepted, but like we just saw, they have wisdom that can be very useful for understanding how to elevate Judaism in our generation. That's called the fourth revolution. It means that you have to teach them Torah. The ones who want to come and learn Torah, you teach it to them. And when they convert, they bring with them many treasures, some of which we're not aware of. So during the rest of the week, Bezrat Hashem, we'll look at some of the treasures that are locked into this incredible story of Yitro and what he brought with him.